One of the mistakes people make with kids with difficult temperaments is they make it personal. Why are you doing this to me? Why do you keep making my day so difficult? We talk to our kids about their behavior as though they're doing it to ruin our lives. And they're not at all. They're behaving. That's what children do. And many parents will make the mistake of personalizing that. Can't you just be good for me? I tell parents something as simple as set the game up, play Chutes and Ladders with them, and then the kid starts crying when the parent wins. That's a point to say, hey, I won, and this is a nice moment for me, and you're not always going to win, and I know that doesn't feel good. We could play again, but right now, this is also hurtful for the other person, right? I'm your mom. That's why we tell kids to do the high five at the end of a game, but it can't always go your way.
Welcome back to the Rena Malik MD podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Rena Malik, urologist and pelvic surgeon. Today, our guest is Dr. Ramani Durvasula. She is a clinical psychologist and professor emeritus at California State University in Los Angeles. She is well recognized for her work in narcissism and narcissistic personality disorders, and in particular, how they impact mental health, relationships, and the workplace. She has just released her new book called It's Not You: Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic Relationships. She's also an author of 2 other books, which are also regarding narcissistic personality disorders, and she has her own podcast called Navigating Narcissism. It was a pleasure to have her on today. We talked about a variety of things. Particularly, we delved into exactly what a narcissist is and how it impacts you individually when you're in a relationship with a narcissist. How can you identify those red flags or warning signs of a narcissist, and what are they like in bed? What can it be like to have sex with a narcissist, and how that can actually complicate your relationship and make it more difficult to let go. We talk about narcissism not only in relationships, but in family dynamics as well as with friends. We talked about how being in a relationship with a narcissist has a profound impact on your self-worth and even your physical health, and how we as clinicians can better help our patients identify those narcissistic relationships or identify how they may be impacting their physical health. Welcome, Dr. Ramani. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am so excited to talk about your new book and all about narcissism. I asked on social media for questions, and so many people are interested in this topic, and rightfully so. And I think the first thing that comes up often is, what exactly is a narcissist? Is it just being self-centered? Is it more than that?
It's much, much more than that. Narcissist is a person. I prefer narcissistic person, but a narcissist is a person with a narcissistic personality. Okay. So a narcissistic personality is a personality that's stable, pervasive, consistent across situations, and it's characterized by low empathy or variable empathy, entitlement, grandiosity, arrogance, a need for validation, excessive need for validation and admiration, self-centeredness and selfishness, superficiality, excessive vanity, a need for control. There's a lot of jealousy. There's a lot of competitiveness. They're very superficial. So those are sort of the traits we see. Now, going alongside that are the behaviors that accompany that. And that can be things like dismissiveness, invalidation, minimizing other people's pain, having contempt for other people, gaslighting them, lots of rage. And it can either be overt rage or passive aggressive, withholding, silent treatment. They shift blame onto other people. They don't take responsibility. There's a lot of betrayal, a lot of lying. And the one thing to remember about the narcissistic personality, the reason they have all of those antagonistic traits I just listed, is that it's all sort of cloaking this very deep, unconscious, unprocessed, inaccessible to them sense of insecurity and shame. And so when anything nudges at that, they disappointed, things don't go the way they want, they're frustrated, they don't get enough likes on Instagram, their career doesn't go the way they want, they just have a bad day, they will lash out at other people. There's a real lack of capacity to regulate. And so all that together is what a narcissist is. It's on a continuum. At the mild end, I would say it's someone who is sort of emotionally immature. They may throw tantrums. They may be, again, excessively concerned with things like Instagram likes above and beyond, above what empathy for other people. They will not be aware of what other people need. We could call them extremely annoying. I don't think a long-term committed relationship would be healthy with someone like that, but they maybe not be harmful. At the extreme end, we see more of a malignant narcissism. Here's where we see patterns like coercion, exploitativeness, like taking advantage of people, isolation, much more severe manipulation. And at that side, it can actually literally be dangerous. We might actually see violence and aggression much more sort of in a pronounced way. Most people, however, are dealing with the stuff in the middle, not just an annoyance and not a major danger and risk. Moderate narcissism is enough to actually really do emotional harm to someone who's in the relationship. It's all the patterns I talked about, the manipulation and the invalidation and all of it. It's consistent enough, but there's enough good days in there that actually confuse the issue, because people will say, well, it wasn't a bad holiday season, but then boom, or we were doing fine, and then the thing at work didn't work out, boom, whatever it may be. These people will say that these are relationships that just as they feel like this is not good for me, something happens that sort of strengthens their resolve to say, okay, maybe I can make this work out. Lots of justifying and all of that. And It's Not You, the book, really focuses on this sort of midstream, moderate level of narcissism, because it's what so many people are struggling with. When they hear the more severe stories, they think, that's not my story. I'm not dealing with someone who almost sounds like a psychopath. And when they hear the stories of people who are sort of in these sort of Instagram narcissist relationships, are like, mine's a lot worse than that. So you can almost feel when people are talking about narcissistic relationships, like you're listening to very different kinds of stories.
Yeah. And I think you touched on some things that are really important to highlight. Persistence, right? Like it's something that is always ongoing. It's not just a one-off. Everyone has moments where maybe they feel a little selfish or they do something in their self-interest over someone else's, but it's sort of this ongoing pattern that keeps reappearing.
Right. And personality is consistent. By definition, it's a consistency. And so, like you said, it's not a one-off. It's not a person being unempathic and cruel and behaving badly with a hotel clerk one time, give me the suite kind of thing. It's not that. It is, or when we see when a healthy person who is not narcissistic, or a more agreeable person, or a more emotionally stable person has a bad moment, because we all have them, we try to make amends very quickly. We make a genuine apology. We take responsibility. Say, I'm so sorry. That was not called for. I apologize. I'm sorry if I hurt. I'm sorry if I hurt you, or whatever it may be. But I am sorry. A healthy person will quickly get there, and ideally attempt to change their behavior down the road.
Yeah. And then you mentioned that it's rooted in insecurity and shame. So one of my followers asked, are people born this way or do they become this way? And so how does someone develop the sense of insecurity and shame that becomes so strongly a part of their personality?
So the people are not born narcissistic. I mean, by that definition, every infant in the world is narcissistic, because they're self-centered. They only care about their own needs, and they don't care about their caregivers. And that's not how it works. So people are born, however, with temperaments. And there are certain temperaments a person could be born with. Consider it almost the genetic part of the personality, the biologically transmitted one, that there are certain temperaments that would make someone more vulnerable to the development of narcissism in adulthood. And these would be what we might call more difficult or challenging, difficult to soothe temperaments, maybe more externalizing, more attention-seeking temperaments as the child gets older. The caregiver might be very frustrated with this infant, with this child. And so that child's likely to experience more invalidating stuff in their world. And then they have this temperament that's actually, it's easy to turn it into an antagonistic direction, right? However, not all narcissistic people had that difficult temperament, though a lot do as a child. And not all people with difficult temperaments, more importantly, go on to become narcissistic, right? It also comes down to that early environment. And so that insecurity, that shame, where does that come from? That usually comes from their interactions with their early environment. This might be a child who was shamed for their needs, shamed for their they were in an environment where things were very abusive and they couldn't make it right. So they might have watched someone else being abused and they couldn't help them. That can create a sense of powerlessness and shame. So it's this sense, often the kids who especially grow up in environments of adversity do feel a sense of helplessness, a sense of powerlessness, that they couldn't make it okay. And they may also be treated in a way that's disparaging. They may be called names. They may be mocked. They may be made fun of. So it's not unusual for narcissism to grow out of a place of adversity. But the other side of that coin is that narcissism, I should say, can also come out of a place of, I would say, sort of over Overindulgence. The child being told they're more special than anyone. They're the best, better than anyone else. They're the most special. They shouldn't have to wait in a line like everyone else. So it's, in a sense, it's not that the child is special. All children are special. All human beings are special in their fashion. It's this idea, no one's more, you're more special. You're more special than everybody else. And that gets ingrained into the child. The thing is, though, one day that child learns as they come into adolescence and adulthood, they ain't that special. They aren't good at everything. And there's a shame in, I was supposed to be special and I'm not able to do this thing. And if I'm so special, why can't I do this thing? And if I can't do this thing, oh, that's gross. And so instead of being given a healthy, well-rounded sense of self, where we learn what we're good at and what we're not good at, that the child gets to cultivate what they are good at and not feel foolish because they're not good at, but man, maybe not everyone's good at math, but my goodness, you can fix everything in this house. That's amazing. The child who hears that might then feel like, oh, I'm going to keep on this track of fixing things. The child who faces the sense of, well, you're going to study STEM and you're going to go become a science person becomes, that child who can't do that and was told they're so special and can't, and they really feel that all that overindulgence they were getting was contingent on that, that can create that sense of insecurity and shame too.
Wow. So listening to this, I'm sort of feeling like, how do you raise kids with either difficult temperaments and not overindulge them so they don't turn into narcissists? I mean, what are the sort of red flags as parents we should look out for in our children, and how should we respond to their difficult temperaments in the appropriate way?
Well, one of the mistakes people make with kids with difficult temperaments is they make it personal. Why are you doing this to me? Why do you keep making my day so difficult? We talk to our kids about their behavior as though they're doing it to ruin our lives, and they're not at all. They're behaving. That's what children do. And many parents will make the mistake of personalizing that. Can't you just be good for me? Mm-mm. When you have a child with a difficult temperament, it's harder parenting. I mean, no one ever said this was an even playing field. Some kids are tougher to parent than others. And so when you have that child with more of externalizing, attention seeking, maybe difficult to soothe, harder to regulate child, it's everything from the parent digging into their own well of patience, which isn't always easy because not all parents have that capacity, don't always have the resources. Parental stress plays a role here, but it's also things like channeling that. Like that might be a kid who just needs to run around, and you putting them into physical activity. It doesn't have to be like, well, my kid's going to be a great athlete. No. Just let them run around. Take them outside. Like let them have things that sort of use their energy. Let them put it into a creative pursuit. They may really enjoy getting a paintbrush and helping you paint the garage, which is a very tactile kind of task, which might sort of harness them. Don't be shy about bringing mindfulness into your child's life, like teaching mindfulness and meditative practices in childhood. It should be part of, this should have started literally in preschool, where every single day these children think that just like they brush their teeth, that there's a period of time that they orient to their body, that they orient to their breath, that they learn the power of that. No adults seem to know that. Very few. Just came off the freeway. That's clearly the case. But I think for children, just like they can build up so many habits, this could be one, especially for kids who do have those more like climbing out of their skin temperaments. You're giving them tools and skills to calm down, but it's really about how you talk to them. So many kids with these difficult temperaments are told, stop that, sit down, calm down. Oh my gosh, don't be difficult. Are you going to ruin my day? We have to watch how we speak to a child, and educators need to be taught how to be with these kids. And that also structural class sizes. I mean, you see how this gets bigger. It's Bronfenbrenner, right? We go from the individual, we're already out now, to an exosystem, that this isn't just, I mean, I think it gets tricky when we just make it about the parents. Parents are carrying more burden than they have ever carried before. Financial burden, stress burden, and parents aren't always perfect. So having a better village around them would help. And that means that we have to fix the whole economy and give people a livable wage and make housing more affordable. You know what I'm saying? So this is a bigger conversation, but little things we do with our kids and not making it about us. Our kids are not behaving badly to stick it to us. They just really aren't. They may be behaving badly, though, to get our attention. And then that's a look inward conversation. Now, to the overindulgence part, your kid's not more special than anyone else's. Your kid's not more special than my kid. They're not more special than a kid. They're a kid, and they're special because children are special and deserve safety and protection. But don't, that though, we're never going to make any progress with, because the parents who are doing that are entitled and often narcissistic. And since we can't change that, they're going to continue this sort of really, really unhealthy way of parenting. These kids are often the ones who become the grandiose narcissists, who I'm all that. Sometimes they become vulnerable narcissists who sort of can't understand why everyone doesn't think they're as special as their parents did. But keep in mind too, this may not just be a parent who says, I adore my kid. Like, I love spending time with them. I love this. That's great. That's great. But you have to be emotionally available, because these kids who are overindulged materially, they get to go to the theme parks and they get every latest gadget and anything that they want. These kids also, though, they often don't get emotionally fed and emotionally nourished. So the parent is able to show up in this very sort of structural way, but not in that emotional way. So these kids often don't get to learn how to emotionally regulate. They don't learn to navigate the waters of disappointment. Disappointment in childhood is the most important thing a child can experience, and teaching them how to regulate in the face of disappointment. You don't always get to win the game. I tell parents something as simple as set the game up, play Chutes and Ladders with them, and then the kid starts crying when the parent wins. That's a point to say, hey, I won, and this is a nice moment for me, and you're not always going to win, and I know that doesn't feel good. We could play again. But right now, this is also hurtful for the other person, right? I'm your mom. It's why we tell kids to do the high five at the end of a game. But it can't always go your way. You don't get the teacher you want. You don't get the whatever you want. And that the child has to be held and told it's going to be okay. And I'm here. I'm not going to reject you. And cry it out. And it's okay to cry it out. We got to let boys cry it out. We stop boys from crying. And boys get every chance to cry as girls, because then they will actually then get more comfortable with their emotional expression rather than bottling it up and it coming out in all kinds of other terrible ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I think all of this there's so much there to unpack, but I think you're right. My parents grew up in India, where it is a village, right? Like, everyone took care of the kids. The kids would be outside playing and anybody could come and discipline them. Anybody could come and say, don't do that. You had grandparents, you had other people around who could help you when the parent couldn't be there for you to do the things you needed. And I think that's really a shame that we don't embrace that as much in this sort of individualistic society in the United States, but it does put a lot of pressure on parents. As you mentioned, there's so much, right? There's so much that is at this point in time, financial pressures and things of that nature that weren't there maybe in the last few generations.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything's changed. Like, and there's so many pieces moving at the same time, but we don't value children in our policy decisions. That's the bottom line. Or we would put more money into education. We would put more money into nutrition. We would put more money into maternal health care. Where money is spent is what teaches us where the society values. And based on that, this society does not value children, which is a huge mistake.
Huge.
Because that's where you get your mental health crises. That's where those chickens come home to roost. But again, it's hard enough for me to deal with one narcissist. I'm not going to change society. So.
And the sad part is, so you did say some narcissistic parents end up overindulging their kids and then they become narcissists, but it's not always the case. It comes from a place of shame, which is actually really sad, because they may have had a horrible childhood and they grow up to essentially react to that by being a narcissist. So they're not necessarily like a bad person initially. They just got put in this bad situation.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so this is where it gets tricky, right? Because that's sad. I'm sad for them. And if they're going to behave badly, backstory is not that interesting, because the person who's in a relationship with them, who's being mistreated, their first place they go to is, that's sad. They've had a tough backstory. They're carrying all this shame. I feel so bad for them. And you know what they do? They justify their behavior. And 20 years later, they look back and say, all I did was justify, and they just kept mistreating me. We have to have the point at which we say, your backstory was tough and you could go and get help for that and work it through. But the way your behavior showing up is unacceptable. And we have to be able to call unacceptable behavior unacceptable regardless of context. And I know that's a controversial position, but the fact of the matter is, if a person's not going to address the context, go do the vulnerable psychotherapeutic work around shame and continue harming people, believe it or not, it feels like the field of mental health is more than willing to allow a group of people to be relegated into the seat of being harmed by narcissists, because they had a tough backstory. They have. And I've worked with many narcissistic folks clinically. Don't get me wrong. In that room, we can focus on that all day. But at some point in that room, I also have to say, you need to take responsibility for your behavior. I get that. And we can understand why it's harder for you maybe to flex that empathy muscle. And it's harder for you to flex that compassion. It's going to be harder for you. And it's important because otherwise this person cannot stay in this. And they may leave. And what the narcissistic person wants, which is impossible, is I want to keep behaving this way and I want people to keep putting up with it. So yes, it's often a very, very sad story for why people have these personalities.
When was the last time that your doctor spent an hour with you, listening to you and trying to really understand what your goals are? And when did you actually leave the doctor's office knowing exactly what your treatment plan was and what your next steps are? At my practice, Rena Malik, MD, I aim to do just that. I specialize in sexual dysfunction, bladder problems, hormone management, and pelvic pain. And I want to revolutionize how we take care of patients and get to know each and every one of you. That's why when you come to my practice, I'm 100% present with you for an entire hour. There's no one else involved in your care. It is entirely you and me. And if for some reason you want to ask me a question between visits or you forgot to ask me a question, you can message me at any time with a guaranteed response, with no extra hidden fees or costs associated with messages or any other communication that we have. And you don't even have to call the office to make an appointment. You can do it all easily online at www.renamalikmd.com/appointments. I see patients in Newport Beach and Los Angeles, California. I also see patients for telemedicine visits who are located in the states of California, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Texas, Florida, Illinois, and Virginia. And if you're not located in those states, I can still see you for an educational visit where we can talk about your condition as well as what treatment options exist so that you can take that information to your doctor and discuss what you think is the best option for you. I can't wait to see you. What are some red flags when you're starting to meet someone? Because initially you've mentioned in the book, they're very charming, they're very captivating. How can you sort of start seeing those red flags and sort of, because it's sort of a fluctuating pattern, how can you sort of start to spot out like, okay, maybe this isn't like, when should I start standing up for myself and saying this is not acceptable?
You never say it to them because they're not going to listen. When you say it's not acceptable, you say it within yourself. And that's already hard because people, as they come into these relationships, like I say in the book, we're attracted to them because they're charming and they're charismatic and they're confident. We're often taught that this is exactly the person we should be looking for. They're often also very successful too. So all these boxes are getting ticked. And then it doesn't start badly. These relationships, especially adult onset narcissistic relationships, start out quite nicely. You feel like this person gets you like no one else ever has. They're so fun. They're so romantic. You really feel like you've sometimes been swept into a fairy tale or some sort of idealized situation, right? And so it's almost like there's this process people go through where in the sort of love bombing stage, it almost feels like it's close to 100% good. As weeks go by, it becomes 90% good, 10% bad, 80% good, 20% bad, 70%, 30%. And then you start getting to 50%. Then you start getting to 20% good and 80% bad. But it was a gradual titration. And as that titration happened, and it happened gradually, the other person in that relationship starts justifying. Because it's not always bad. It's 90% good, 10% bad. Who complains about that? That's every relationship. So now the justifications, though, become part of that relationship. They didn't mean it. They had a tough childhood. They're working so hard to provide for us. We had so much fun. I love having sex with them, whatever the reasons. And there could be all of these and then some, that we start making justifications. And this is where it starts getting really dark. People start blaming themselves in the relationship. Maybe this is my fault. Maybe I'm not trying hard enough. Maybe I didn't say that right. And when you throw in the gaslighting dynamic, where basically the narcissistic person throws back on the other person and says, I never said that. That never happened. And I think you have a memory problem or something. There's something wrong with you. Now they're telling you you're impaired. You're even more destabilized. You internalize that. Before long, you have this inversion where the person in the narcissistic relationship feels like they're responsible for this problem. Until a person gets educated about what narcissism is, Because people are feeling it. They're feeling it in their body. These people get sick. People in these narcissistic relationships start getting sick in a variety of ways. Some subtle, some more obvious. Some people say I'm more trouble sleeping because I'm ruminating. I'm not eating as well. I'm not taking care of myself. I don't talk to my friends as much. All the stuff that's essential to self-care, but it's all happening slowly. So that idea of finally identifying that this behavior is unacceptable, sometimes it happens from the outside. It might be a friend who says, whoa, like, is that how he always talks to you? Because of course, the narcissistic person isn't going to let that many people get close to your relationship. And you'll say, what? And your friend might say, that wasn't okay. And that's sometimes the first light switch moment where a person might even say, no, it's how it is. But when that friend goes away, they're going to say, And when those light switches start popping on, that's where it even gets harder because people are like, okay, is it me? Is it them? Am I being sensitive? So this isn't as much as I say we have to recognize behavior is unacceptable, it's not that easy. As it gets worse and worse, there's usually a rock bottom for everyone in these relationships. Sometimes it's infidelity, sometimes it's physical violence, sometimes it's financial misbehavior, and sometimes it's just death by 1,000 cuts. It's just how many times you can bear up against this.
Yeah. You mentioned the physical thing, and I can guarantee you we all see these victims of narcissistic relationships because I see plenty of patients who have pelvic pain, who have overactive bladder, who have interstitial cystitis, sort of urologic issues that are sort of on this chronic pain continuum, and they often have a lot of comorbid conditions that are like anxiety, fibromyalgia, migraines, right? These sort of conditions that we talk about with central sensitization or things like that. But I wonder if really one of the big root causes is that they're in these narcissistic relationships. And I can guarantee you, I've never asked anyone specifically about narcissism. I've asked, is your relationship good, right? And most people will say, yeah, it's fine, or, we're okay. But most people are not divulging. So, they're very in details about their relationship when they're at the urologist, unless it's sexual. So in terms of questions that I can ask or other clinicians can ask, if we see patients that we might be concerned are having bad relationships at home, that might, trigger at least a light bulb for us to say, maybe you should, read your book or assess this.
I mean, again, you said you already are asking how is your relationship? I think what you don't ever want to ask the person is your relationship good? Because you've already now primed the yes, versus if you ask, how is your relationship? You might get more of like, it's fine. So you're still going to get that kind of that. Because a lot of folks in these relationships aren't aware. In fact, the people who have more physiological fallout, as you're talking about, central sensitization, whether it's migraines alongside any number of urologic issues, when you see that, I think the more we see that transference of the physical pain into the physiological, those are the clients who might be least likely that they're not in a healthy relationship. One thing we're working on, I'm actually building it out now, and we're doing some of the original piloting of it, right? The initial piloting of it is developing instruments. Like, so you can actually have this in the packet of pre-check-in before you see the patient, or even as they check in, like checklists that they could fill in. So that then, instead of them having to answer this very broad question, how's your relationship, or is your relationship going well, or even is your relationship going badly, there would be a chance to get a more quantitative indicator, or even look at those responses and see that when you bring it down into its component processes, what they're answering fine to actually may not be healthy. The other thing to ask someone is, do you feel emotionally safe in your relationship? Do you feel like you're able to express yourself openly in your relationship? That would be a different way to ask that question, because when we think of safety, people immediately go to, well, I don't think they're going to beat me up. It's more of if you say emotionally safe, do you feel like you can share of yourself fully? That might give people a little bit of pause and say, well, it's we don't really talk about that stuff. And then you could go a step further and say, why not? Like, well, but the problem is, I also know that physicians are on insurance, and you get how long, 15 minutes, 12 minutes, whatever tiny amount of time you get. So I'm well aware of the limits that are also on physicians. So something that can also happen, instead of asking every patient the question and hoping to get an answer, is providing psychoeducation to all of them. So it's whether it's the handouts that are available in the waiting room, whether it's the stuff something that's put into their hands where it may not even be so much that you're asking them this, because many won't give you an accurate answer, and not because they're even being resistant or in denial. They just haven't identified it as such, that if they're being shown something, being offered something, that they might say, that's good. I might need to pay attention to this, because I have to be frank with you. When a client gets to the point, or patient gets to the point where they are thinking, this is a disaster. My marriage is a disaster. Like, this is awful. And this person mistreats me. You might actually start seeing some more physiological regulation at that point, because now that awareness, I think that the brain is going to process that very differently than the absolute everything's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there's so many complex factors that play into it, but that's really fascinating. Tell me, in terms of, we talk about sex on this podcast. So in terms of in the bedroom, are narcissistics a certain way in the bedroom?
It's funny. They just had an article come out in USA Today about this. Exactly. I was speaking about this. And we did an Instagram live, I think 2 nights ago, or last night or something. So sex is a funny thing with them, because it can actually be a very complicated, fraught space in a relationship. Narcissistic people really do use sex as a place of control, of domination, of shaming. Like, it's not the healthiest space, but narcissistic people can also be very attractive sexual partners and very skilled sexual partners, because they want validation and admiration. They want to be told, you gave me the best orgasm ever, or you're the best lover. So they will often, because narcissistic people are successful for a reason. It's often because they're quite obsessive in their focus to get something right, including sex. And people with narcissistic personalities have been found to be more what we call reward sensitive. They are sort of our dopamine group. They love stuff that's high reward and quick reward. So gambling and alcohol and drugs and sensation seeking, any shopping, pornography, exactly. Yeah. Anything that's that quick hit. And so sex is going to be no different. That's going to be one more thing where you do it and it feels good. So sex and narcissism, they like sex, right? The challenge is narcissistic people are very, very limited in their capacity for intimacy. So some of the things we know is that sex addiction, define it as you wish, is correlated with narcissism. Not all people with sex addiction are narcissistic, but a decent chunk are. And in fact, many narcissistic people will sort of commandeer sex addiction as the explanation for why they're chronically cheating on a spouse or chronically watching pornography, but it's actually, they don't meet the criteria. It feels more acceptable than, I'm really selfish and I don't care if I'm hurting your feelings kind of thing. There can be a lot of shaming around sexuality when it comes to narcissistic folks. So narcissistic people like to hold the stopwatch for the relationship. They control the timers. And so they want things to move at a pace that works for them. So when you first meet a narcissistic person and you say, hey, I'd love things to slow down, sex is a great example of that, where a person might say like, I don't know that I'm ready to go sort of into this like this, right? And then the kind of pushback you might see is that the narcissistic person is like, oh, I guess you really don't want a relationship, or, I guess, what are you, a prude? Like, are you frigid? They'll use words like that, which shame the other person, gaslight the other person who's not those things at all, but they just want to be sure and they want to feel emotionally safe. And people will sort of feel they feel compelled, that they'll say, I like enough things about this person. The sex thing got weird, but maybe I am a prude, so I'm going to go ahead and have sex with them. And then it wouldn't be unusual 9 months, a year into a relationship where the narcissistic person might actually shame the person. Well, you gave that up quickly. You give it up quickly for everyone else. So then they'll twist and weaponize that. They will often try to coerce or manipulate or encourage. I'm using a range of words. Coerce obviously is extreme. Encourage or manipulate or pull a partner into sexual behaviors they may not be fully comfortable with, then shame them for it later. So it can really make it this very, very confused place. And narcissistic people may withhold sex as a way of punishing a partner. A person may feel like sex is a place of connection. So the narcissistic person, that's how they'll sort of exert their power, by not showing up that way. And the sex might be performative and it might be theatrical, but it often doesn't feel connected. It can often feel sort of like the the sort of the oxytocin part of the sex tends to be missing, right? The cuddling and the
cuddly.
holding and all of that. Like that almost is sort of like, you can imagine that sort of film trope where the person sort of staring at the ceiling and counting down, like, how long do we have to do this for? So that's sort of a narcissistic kind of a sort of, please don't make me do this real genuine intimacy part. I was really good with the other part of it. And so it's not the healthiest space, but because they care so much about sex, they often, many people will say, I felt not only trauma bonded to this narcissistic person, meaning like I felt like I couldn't get out of it and I kept justifying it. The sex muddies the waters, because some people will say the sex was the hard part to leave, because it actually was, it felt good. They really were so devoted to my climax, my orgasm, that people thought they'd sort of lucked into something and they don't want to leave it. And so it can confuse the relationship even more.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In terms of what if that other partner who's like not the narcissist wants to pleasure themselves or use sex toys or watch pornography? I imagine that the narcissist feels threatened by that. Is that typical?
I think that if another partner was trying, if a partner came into a narcissist's life and actually was suggesting more novelty, might even be the one who was saying, let's do more interesting things. My bet would be that the narcissistic person would try to shame that behavior, because that's such a powerful tool of manipulation. I think it would also shame the narcissistic person who may come to the realization that their sexual repertoire isn't maybe as robust as this new partner they're with. And so that sense of, look, I'm supposed to be all that. I'm a interesting, compelling, whatever the heck I am, that somebody else is coming in like this might also make them feel inadequate, sexually inadequate as a partner. And so that's going to be met with anger. Anytime the narcissistic person feels shame, they tend to react with anger.
So if they felt, for example, like this person's always getting off with their sex toys so easily, they might even feel threatened by that.
Oh, absolutely. Because why are you doing that? Am I not good enough for you? And what the narcissistic person will often do is, especially if the other person, in this case, the sex toy person in the relationship, actually likes the relationship well enough, they haven't fully dug down into the layers of the narcissism, but like it's a fine enough relationship, or you've invested a lot of time in the relationship, or kids, or all the other things that create the glue of a relationship, that when that narcissistic person might feel sort of competitive with your sex toy, as it were, and the person with the sex toy might be insistent and say, this is part of my sexual health. Like, I enjoy this. This is not instead of, this is an addition to, like, it's just me enjoying my body. The narcissistic person may very well threaten abandonment. Like, oh, I guess I'm not good enough. Or I guess I'm not enough. You know what? You're kind of a freak, and they'll sort of shame it, like one might shame a kink or something like that. So they'll shame them. You're weird. You're freaky. And you know what? This isn't for me. Now that person with the sex toy, that's not what the outcome they wanted. They wanted their partner to perhaps join in this and embrace this part of this person's sexuality. So now that person, the other person, the sex toy using person, is feeling like, maybe I need to stop this, or is it worth blowing up this relationship over? And so that can create a lot of confusion. You'd have to be a very, not only sex positive person, but a self-assured person to say, okay, then I'm picking my vibrator over you. Bye. Most people don't do that. And people who do that, they've got this thing figured out like nobody else. And that's not most people. Because like I said, the narcissism up, down, side, the way it's good, it's bad. There are things about these folks who are attractive. When we love someone, we love someone. I mean, that's a whole philosophical conversation. Are people willing to blow up their relationship over a vibrator? Maybe in the early months, sure. But I don't think when someone's years in, that's the norm.
Yeah. That's really challenging. Because, I talk about it a lot. I think using sex toys or having healthy masturbation practices is totally normal and acceptable. And I do see people have issues with their partners, maybe participating, whether it's female or male. I don't want to gender specific because everyone does it. And I think it's a huge issue. And sometimes it's definitely coming from a place of insecurity, of feeling like I'm not enough for that person. But sort of realizing that there could be some narcissistic traits potentially in your partner, that's challenging.
It could, and again, I wouldn't say that, for example, if you have a partner who's nice all the time, compassionate, empathic, respectful, loving, it's a healthy relationship out of the bedroom. and it's only in the bedroom where this sort of, I don't feel comfortable with the sex toys, you're masturbating and I don't know that I'm comfortable with that. That's a different conversation.
Absolutely.
You know what
Yeah.
I'm saying? And I find that to be an unusual conversation, that someone to be that agreeable in real life and not in this other space. So if the person feels like you're masturbating more than we're having sex,
Well, then that person may actually have a problem.
Yeah. So then that could be an issue too.
Yeah. Well, I think there's definitely a lot of insecurities in the bedroom because we're not taught how to talk about sex at all, right? And another thing that kids should learn about, right? But I think in general we're not taught, and so people have so many insecurities about themselves, their bodies. And they may, this may be the only space where that insecurity shows through. So definitely don't label them as a narcissist, but definitely something to work through, because it's important that you feel secure in your body and be able to be vulnerable in sex, which is what it is, being vulnerable in the moment with your partner.
It is. And being vulnerable with a narcissistic person will ultimately really harm you. And I think that that's the challenge. So what's happening outside of the bedroom? Like I said, empathy, compassion, respect, perspective taking, all the stuff that makes a healthy relationship. That, hey, listen, are there relationships out there that are healthy in those ways and not the best in the bedroom? Yes, they are. I mean, it's like, just because everything's healthy there doesn't mean things are healthy there. I mean, people have histories that are complicated. And so but I think it's a very different conversation when you're being vulnerable with a narcissistic person. Psychologically, the harm can be such that people will say, I don't know that I psychologically feel safe with this person. I don't ever think it's a good idea for someone to have sex with someone they don't feel psychologically safe with.
Yeah, that's a recipe for disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know that we're now seeing patients not only in Newport Beach, but also in Beverly Hills, Los Angeles? If you want to see me in person and you're located in the LA County area, make an appointment today at www.renamalikmd.com/appointments. Again, that's www.renamalikmd.com/appointments. Looking forward to seeing you. So, social media has taken over, right? We didn't grow up with social media. It's sort of a newer phenomenon. How has that changed for narcissists, or like for the emergence of narcissism? Do you think it's played a role?
It's played an interesting role. Social media doesn't cause narcissism. What it does is it's an accelerant. It's a catalyst. It gives it a platform. Narcissistic people excel at social media. They love the validation. They love the admiration. They love the idea that people might envy their lives. Now, some of them might be saying here, no, that's just my business model. I'm like, yep. And not everyone does your business because they are not psychologically organized like you. Does that make sense? So they'll say, no, this is how my business works. Most people don't have the stomach for living a life that's like that. So it's sort of congruent for them. They really, they love what social media can do. It's every word that comes out of their mouth, they can share. And if they have a big enough platform, everyone seems to be listening to it in thrall. So grandiose narcissism, I think the grandiose narcissists, sort of, we see them more now because social media has given them a platform. Back in the day, when I was growing up, there was no such thing, even all the way through graduate school. In fact, through adulthood, when I had kids, there was no such thing as social media. And so I will always remember the day when somebody said to me, you got to look at this thing. It's called Facebook. Have you heard of it? I've never heard of this. When I said a Facebook, to me, it was the book they give you at university, with all of our pictures in it.
Yeah.
And so I said, what is this? And they said, go take a look, create an account, take a look. And I remember, the people are trying to add you are people you went to high school with. But in those early days, 2008, 2009, it was that. And then I remember looking at this and saying, oh my God, this is going to be a disaster with the narcissistic folks, because it used to be for them to get validation, they would either have to get it from their family or they'd have to dress up and leave the house. And how much could you do? You weren't going to be able to scream with a megaphone in the middle of the street. So they get smaller pockets of validation. So all of a sudden, overnight, people now could become celebrities in their own world. It wasn't just the movie stars on the marquee. Everyone could create that kind of like attention on them, and they have. Where social media has gotten very interesting, though, is I think what it's done is it's really lit a fire under this issue of vulnerable narcissism. And vulnerable narcissism, unlike the grandiose narcissist folks who are arrogant and pretentious and attention-seeking and look at me and aren't I great, aren't I interesting, the vulnerable narcissistic folks are sullen, resentful, angry, victimized, aggrieved, lots of failure to launch. They feel that they don't get, life isn't fair to them. Everyone's out to get them. It's a very angry style. Now that the vulnerable narcissistic folks, have an anonymous weapon whereby they can attack people and see that other people's lives are going just fine, that has completely blown that issue out of the water. And I think a lot of the issues we're seeing in terms of violence out in the world can probably be tracked back to this vulnerable narcissism meets social media piece.
Oh gosh, that's frightening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's only going to get worse.
Wow. And you've mentioned that narcissists are very earthquake, huh?
You want to keep that on the episode, hon.
Yeah, maybe we will. It's just like tying the.
That was an earthquake, my friends.
Yes, that was. So you've mentioned that narcissists are very charismatic. They're often high performers. So are you seeing that in terms of leadership, the people that we look at who become our leaders, are they more likely to be narcissists?
Narcissistic people naturally turn to leadership. I mean, they want to be in charge, right? A lot of actually sane people will take the position of, I don't want to be a leader. I'm kind of content where I am at. I'm good. But the wanting to be a leader, and the tricky bit with narcissistic people is they want to be the leader, but they don't want to do they don't want to actually attend in an empathic, healthy way to the role of leadership. It's basically, how can I make myself bigger? So that's why when narcissistic people get into leadership, it can ultimately be a little bit of a problem, a big bit of a problem, because it's still all about them. And so the decisions they make are not necessarily going to benefit the people they lead, but rather they're going to do whatever they can do to keep getting validation as a leader. So throughout history, I can't say this is a new phenomenon. Your history books are full of the narcissists. In fact, we don't hear about ordinary people from history because they didn't do the things that would make history, right? And so they absolutely are drawn to leadership. They are overrepresented in leadership, and they want to be in charge. It's very much the power, control, domination, motivation of a narcissistic person is very much, you see it in their wanting to be leaders.
Well, that's a recipe for disaster too. I mean,
absolutely.
Our country being led by narcissists and having access to nuclear codes sounds like a horrible
any country.
Thing.
And I think that what happens is that because narcissistic leaders are so often charismatic, right? They draw attention, and people in them see. It's really interesting to watch how people imprint on a narcissistic leader. And because narcissistic people are so seemingly confident, even despite all that insecurity, they sort of have this sort of carnival barker kind of confidence. Come on in, you'll never have seen anything like this before. This is the greatest show on earth, and kind of believe it. It's almost delusional, where the rest of us might be like, I'll show you this. I don't know how good it is, but they have that big confidence, and they can really. And they know how to read a room. Narcissistic people are also very socially perceptive. That's why they're great salespeople. So you combine that sort of salesiness that they have, the lack of empathy, the entitlement, the need to be the one in power, control, and domination. You can see how they can trick an entire group of people, whether in a company, whether in a country, whether in a state, whether in a town. It doesn't matter. And it is amazing how malleable people are in the hands of a narcissistic person. Look at all the cults that have been out there. The people can really get them in this way. They're very, very convincing. They have a lot of conviction in a strange way. And so they're great at selling a point of view that benefits them.
And that's why we're so drawn to them.
We are drawn to them. And it's unfortunate. It's almost like, how do I teach people to be scared of charm and charisma?
You can't. You can't.
I mean, you have to go on through it, and you're like, okay, charming people scare me. I'm not drawn to charming charisma. I'll tell you, when I meet charming and charismatic people, I'm like, I'm going to just move my seat. Or it was real nice to meet you. I got to go. I find it aversive because I know where it's likely going to go. And I'm sure I've probably missed out on meeting some lovely, charming, charismatic people, but I'm willing to take the risk to avoid the possibility.
That is so interesting because I can think of so many people. But the other thing I think about this that we don't talk about enough, or people don't talk, they always talk about relationships with narcissistic people, but what about being friends? Like just not a romantic relationship, but even having close friends that are narcissistic can have a huge impact on your day to day.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, narcissistic friends, we actually don't talk about it enough. Friendships are very powerful social spaces for us, especially for people who are not already in committed relationships. And I think younger people are turning to friends as very significant social players in their lives, whereas in prior generations, it really became about the intimate partner. And because of that, and friends are also very influential developmentally. Younger people tend to rely more on friendships as a social kind of connection, maybe than do older folks. And if they're younger, emerging adulthood, that's also going to affect sort of their social and emotional development. But all of that said, narcissistic friends, in some ways, it can be a very similar process. The tricky bit is that sometimes we meet friends when we're very young, right? Personality continues to develop till about 25, and then it kind of gets a little bit more cemented. Someone we met new in high school, right? You know, a lot of our sort of adolescent silliness, we thought, oh, that's just adolescent silliness. And we get older and older, and perhaps they get more and more selfish, but there can be a nostalgic link to the early origins of that friendship. But narcissistic friendships can be very harmful. It can really lead to big betrayals of trust, lots of loss of trust in self. And sometimes people feel really foolish that they've been played by a friend. It's almost like we get it when it's an intimate relationship, but not as much when it's a friendship. And yet the harms of narcissistic friendship can be experienced at the same level as the harm of any other narcissistic relationship.
Is it much harder, you think, for people to disconnect from a narcissistic friendship that they've had for since childhood than it is to maybe disconnect with an intimate partner they've had for a few months?
Yes, I would actually say that yes. If it's only been a few months with the intimate partner and they're still also struggling with a narcissistic friend they've known since they were a little kid, absolutely. It has almost a familial vibe at that point, right? Somebody who's watched you grow up, where there's a sense of loyalty, where there's a sense of history. The reason long-term relationships, no matter how toxic they become, are difficult to let go of is we need shared historians in our lives. That's how our brains develop, right? And so without that, we can feel as though we almost doubt ourselves, like, what's wrong with me? I'm cutting people out. Maybe it's me. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I can't get along with people. And the more we self-blame, the less we're able to clearly see that other person's behavior. But the fact of the matter is friendships, like all relationships, sometimes don't suit every season of our lives. And that there are some friendships that we grow away from for any number of reasons. Sometimes one friend has kids and the other one doesn't, and that takes you to very different places. But when it's a friend who's behaving in an antagonistic, toxic, invalidating way, we often don't think about. We think about that a lot when it comes to partners, right? We don't think of friends as cheating on us and that kind of thing. But it matters. It matters a lot.
Yeah, and then I could see that pattern would be harder to pick up because it's going to fluctuate and you don't see them every day. So it may be years before you realize you're in a narcissistic relationship with your close friend.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. For some people, it'll take a lifetime because remember, our exposure to friendship is different too. Unless it's a roommate situation or something like that, we often don't have the 24/7 exposure we might have to an intimate partner. Tensions manifest differently in an intimate relationship. There's different demands around equitability and sharing of responsibilities, chores, child rearing. All of those become more nodes of tension where a friendship may not always get tested the same way. In fact, I think a narcissistic roommate relationship would get tested a lot more quickly than a narcissistic friendship would. So because of that the friendship, it doesn't get the same amount of they're not in your life in the same way. In a way, a friendship, this can get dragged out for a very, 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 very long time.
Yeah, that's tough. And then I guess the hardest relationship to get rid of would be with a narcissistic parent.
Oh, yeah. Well, the narcissistic parent, that's the most complicated relationship of all because the parent's narcissism ultimately shaped your own psychology, right? So narcissistic parents are not healthy parents. They do a lot of harm to their kids in the sense of it could be downright child abuse in some cases, but it can also really be creating an atmosphere of tremendous adversity in the sense of the child is basically, it's a role reversal. The child is expected to be meeting their parents' needs, whatever they are, in terms of not being seen, not being heard, doing the things that the parent expects them to, anticipating their parents' needs, being quiet when the parent wants them quiet, being cheerful When the parent wants them cheerful, the child doesn't get to have a separate emotional state. The parent will say, "What are you so sad about? You have a great life." And the child's sad, and the child doesn't get to have that. Guilt is often used by narcissistic parents. They'll often shame the child's needs. If the child makes a need or a want known, "You're greedy, you're selfish, you're needy, you take advantage of me." And those are the kinds of things that will happen repeatedly. When kids have a narcissistic parent, they walk on eggshells. Because remember, the child needs the parent. It's not like an intimate partner. We don't need an intimate partner. As painful as it might be to end a relationship, we are fully formed adults. The child has no choice. And that attachment need, that survival attachment need, means they got to figure it out. And the figuring out usually means the child negating their sense of self, negating their own needs, devaluing themselves, and viewing themselves as the problem. In essence, blaming themselves and rendering themselves almost unseeing of everything bad that's happening. Because if they see it, it's calamitous, right? That means this person who's supposed to care for me doesn't, and then what? So the child will construct a narrative where the parent is a decent, loving human being. Well, since they're not, all that has to go somewhere, and the child internalizes that.
Gosh, that's so hard. I guess any advice for any young adults who are finally figuring it out, or maybe teenagers who still are, reliant on their parents financially, and for home and food and all those things, how can they kind of survive in that circumstance?
It's tough. I mean, I think it's harder for adolescents who are still, it's such a tough time of life developmentally, right? Because the adolescent themselves is trying to individuate from the parent. That's a healthy thing for an adolescent to do. The narcissistic parent is then losing control of the child. Some narcissistic parents manipulate the child. "How could you leave me? How can, you're so selfish," that kind of thing. So the child feels sort of stunted in their capacity to sort of grow and evolve away from the parent. Some adolescents rebel terribly against these parents to their own detriment. While the rebellion makes all the sense in the world, the rebellion may be self-defeating. The child may getting with the wrong peers, drugs, alcohol, but it's almost like I'll show you, I could be my own person, but it's not in a well-regulated way because they didn't really get to develop that having had this parent. I think above all else, what I'm going to say to anyone, but certainly even a young person who's managing a narcissistic parent, is this is not your fault. The best you can do is say this was a bit of bad luck. This is the parent you pulled out of the grand sort of, karmic abacus that's in the sky, and this is the thing you got stuck with. And so it's bad luck. I tell them, it's like, I know that's a weird way to put it, but that you got a parent or parents who are not up to the task. The other thing I do tell young people, though, is, listen, you just need one healthy parent and you'll be okay. That's one thing we do know. It's like you can fly a plane on one engine sometimes. You just need one healthy parent. And so cultivate that health. If you have that, where it gets really tricky is when one parent is very narcissistically abusive, the other parent is sort of stuck in this horrible, invalidating cycle with them, and often not as available to the kids as they need to be because they're in their own amount of grief and distress and despair over being in this terrible marriage. So the kid there might actually obviously fear or be angry or whatever they feel about the narcissistic parent, but it's negative. Then they have this other parent that they pity, but they're also angry at for not protecting them. So you can see how complicated that this can get. And, it's hard. It's hard for adolescents to think of, can I seek out therapy? Not all school counselors are equipped to hear this. More and more are every day, but to say, this is really toxic. But then even then, the best you can do is sometimes white knuckle it to get out of that circumstance. In young adulthood, maybe giving yourself more and more permission to distance yourself from that family of origin. But sometimes people feel a real sense of guilt of abandoning the other parent in that there's no easy fix here.
Are you loving the Rena Malik MD podcast? Well, I love each and every one of you, and I'm truly honored that you choose to spend a bit of your day or a bit of your week with me. Did you ever hear the actual story of why I started making content online? Well, when I was a resident, I remember having a patient who had bladder cancer. And in order to treat her bladder cancer, we had to remove it and then reconstruct a new bladder called an Indiana pouch. Now, with this new bladder, she would have to catheterize herself through a stoma or an opening on her abdomen in order to empty her bladder. So after surgery, immediately she did great. She went home and no major issues. But subsequently, over the next couple months, she started getting readmitted over and over again to the intensive care unit. And we were really wondering what was going on. Eventually, we figured out that she didn't truly understand that she now had to catheterize herself to empty her bladder. Just the simplest thing that was so pivotal, she didn't understand that. And it was then that I realized as a urologist, I could do the perfect surgery. But if my patient didn't understand the consequences of that surgery, then I failed as their doctor. And once I started practice, I realized that I couldn't teach people everything they needed to know in the 15 or 30 minutes I saw them in my office. And that's when I started creating all my Rena Malik MD content to offer free education to people around the world. And I can tell you that it has been truly one of the most rewarding experiences in my life. And in order to keep providing free content, we need your help. If you are getting value out of this podcast or my other content, I encourage you to join our premium membership. As a member, you'll get early access to the audio and video of the podcast completely ad-free, transcripts of all the episodes, and exclusive access to Ask Me Anything episodes that occur once a month. And during those episodes, I answer questions that are asked only by premium members. So join us today at renamalik.supercast.com. Can't wait to see you there.
You know, you mentioned early in the book a story about yourself, presumably. So if you're open to sharing your story about dealing with narcissism, I think that would be helpful.
Well, I've had it happen in familial relationships. I've had it happen in friendships. I've had it happen in intimate relationships, and I've had it happen in the workplace. So, and I didn't know this. That's actually not even why I got into the work. That's what's so interesting. I got into it through research I was doing and clinical practice I was doing, and I was like, "Ooh, missed that one." And so it's shaped me. It's made me into someone who is very self-doubting, somebody who's very self-blaming, someone who can be eminently gaslightable. And so what that's done is it's made me untrusting. I tend to shirk away from the world. As much as I put myself out there and talk to people about it, I'm talking with people about this thing I know, but I don't trust myself always, in the sense of I don't feel a sense of confidence. So it really undercut me. It slowed me down. It held me back. It kept me from taking professional risks. Because I've been hurt in friendships and intimate relationships, I don't trust people the same way, which keeps my social world small. It's harder to hire into a business when you don't trust people. So it keeps you kind of constrained. But in the same breath, I also know what has worked for me. And again, there's also a cultural piece here. In South Asian families, narcissism is not uncommon. Again, in the sense of collectivist cultures have their own problems. And one of their big problems is that they will protect an abuser. The wagons will circle. We don't talk about this outside the family. Family duty, loyalty, obligation, duty, loyalty. Parents can do no wrong. That's a very harmful stance to take. Worship the ancestors no matter what. I think we can be selective about which ancestors we do worship. And that sort of complete blanket, absolute duty, loyalty, obedience thing is not doing anyone any favors, and that we as a family stick together. Well, if people are getting harmed in that system, that collectivism isn't benefiting anyone in that system other than the lead abuser. So there's a side to that. And having grown up in a very traditional South Asian family, seeing how these family systems are very patriarchal. As a girl, it was definitely a much harder path. And so it's one day you see it clearly. And it's a day you never forget. And once you start seeing it clearly, you have to go through the very painful experience of disengaging and the grief of saying it's never going to be anything more than this. Like, this is it, and seeing its limits. But that I can still be my whole self in it. Like, I can bring my whole self. They may not ever accept my whole self, any of these systems that let me down or harmed me or whatever, but doesn't matter. I can still show up at that. The difference is I no longer expect them to accept me. I no longer expect them to give a damn about me. That has to go out the window. And that's a very different way to interact with people. I've completely pulled out your psychological energy. However, it also means the relationships that are good, I cultivate them like one would a fragile orchid garden. I will water them and take care of them every way I can. I don't always do a great job, but even when I'm tired, I'm like, okay, I'm even thinking this weekend, someone I adore has something happening, and she's too good a person. And as much as it means I have to go to bed and have 4 hours of sleep, it's worth every dime of it, because that person is so much to me. It's knowing who those people are, because these are the people I can be my whole self and I can see their whole selves. So it's a huge series of wake ups, but everything you thought to be true no longer is. And that's really sort of what happened for me. And I can sit there and I can regret and rue all the lost time, all the lost opportunity, all the self-devaluation I carry to this day. Or I can say, look what I now get to do because I walked through these fires, and maybe someone will be helped by it. It's just a different point of view. And then recognizing the gifts in my life through friendships and collaborations and colleagues and people who I work with, that I have to take those as the blessing they are.
That's really a great way to look at it. And to echo your thought, I've not personally, my nucleus family doesn't have any narcissists in it, but I will say certainly in the extended family, I've seen it. And the hardest part, I think, is that if you try to disassociate, you don't just get the guilt of that one person, you get the guilt of the entire system. And it can be really, really difficult to dissociate yourself from that, because you're not only feeling the guilt from the person who obviously you don't like, but also the person maybe you love a lot, and you feel like now you're letting them down.
That's exactly right. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think this is what keeps people really stuck, because they'll say, okay, I'm weighing out, am I going to hurt the person I love? Am I going to safeguard myself by disengaging? And I think this is where I tell people this is also a very personal journey. Within systems, family systems like you just described, you don't get to tell everyone what you're saying. Well, I think the such and such is a narcissist, so I'm going to distance. Nobody's going to get that. But what they might see is they would say, well, why have you pulled back a little bit? And say, I have my reasons, and I hope you can just love me through them, and I love you, and let's find time to spend together, right? Oh, but they miss seeing you. And you can say things like, I know they miss seeing me. Maybe they do miss seeing me, but this is what's healthier for me. You don't have to go down the rabbit hole, because I think what a lot of people want to say, want people to get it. Why you did this. You did this. You know it's good for you. Not everyone's going to sign on. People love the status quo. And understanding this and seeing it and recognizing it within yourself and making changes in your behavior, because you're like, I can't be in these toxic circumstances anymore. People don't like that, because it does change your status quo. Changing status quo is hard. That's why a lot of people stay in these relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. So I think a lot of people who are in these relationships want to know, can these people change? Can you get them to see the wear of their ways or the error of their ways?
Probably not. So when I say that, first of all, a person changing is a pretty unlikely circumstance, in the sense of what we're really looking for is their behaviors to change, because it's their behaviors that are what is harming you. And by behavior, I mean their actions, their gestures, their non-gestures, when they don't show up for you, and their words. Those are all behaviors. And those things for narcissistic people, one of the big deficits, sort of the myopias of the narcissistic, or the nystagmus of the narcissistic relationship, is that they're just simply not aware of how they're affecting other people with their behavior. To become aware of that means that they have to view themselves as less than perfect, and then we see that volcanic rage come out. So getting them to engage in that process as someone who's in their life, it's hard. It's hard enough for a therapist to do that, right? And so the likelihood that they'll go to therapy, find the right therapist, do the vulnerable work for months, if not years, and translate that into behavioral change, and have the resources to be able to afford that kind of therapy for more than the 6 weeks that an insurance company would give them, it's pretty low. Yeah. And if you throw on that if their life isn't going well, economic stresses, other life stresses, they're never going to quite get that equilibrium they need to behave like a better person. Every time they get thrown off kilter, then they're going to start screaming and yelling again. And so you're really asking for, personalities don't really change that much. I mean, I know there's the personalities change. The only evidence we see of significant personality change, frankly, are head trauma or other central nervous system process, or massive trauma in their lives. So trauma is so big that either the person ceases to exist, they may end their own lives, they may just sort of dissociate into sort of a complete existential hole, or it's the wake-up call of all wake-up calls. And in the midst of that wake-up call, we can sometimes see a personality change. Since you can't manufacture a trauma, which could go the other way, and we're certainly not going to change someone's personality by giving them a head injury, because it could also get worse. There is no magic pill. There's none of that. It's just the hard, brutal, vulnerable work of therapy. And that is and most narcissistic people don't think they're the issue. They think this is everybody else's fault. And every so often there's a unicorn, somebody who maybe usually when they're sometimes even a little bit older, they've blown up a lot of their lives. Sometimes they really were devoted to kids and they see how much their behavior harmed their own kids. Like some narcissistic parents, actually, that's the one thing that sometimes pulls them out of themselves is they see a child and now their behaviors let the child down. Sometimes that's the wake-up call. It's pretty rare. And I'd say to anyone listening to this, the odds of you being the exception are slim. That doesn't mean you turn on your heel and walk out. It means that you got to have realistic expectations. This changing on your watch is very, very unlikely.
Yeah. I think the key is they don't have insight.
It's a lack of insight. Yeah, we call it lack of self-reflective capacity, lack of self-awareness, preoccupation with themselves. It's an interesting thing. For as much as they spend only catering to their own needs, they're not aware of themselves. They're also very unclear on their own motivations. They're not clear on why they do what they do. The biggest mistake a person can make with a narcissistic person, other than calling them out, which is a huge mistake, is asking them why. Why did you do that? Why did you do that? They don't have an answer. And they don't like being asked that question because they don't have an answer. So they'll tend to rage out at the other person at that point.
They don't know why.
They don't know why.
Huh. So interesting. Okay. So I want to end the podcast with a few questions that we ask everybody. So tell me something that you know now, and it can be related to this or not, but something you know now that you wish you learned earlier in your life.
I really wish that I had learned to stop caring so much about what other people were thinking and making decisions in line with what I thought other people wanted. It would have changed the course of my life.
Oh, that's part of our South Asian culture.
Very
we grow up,
much so.
We grow up worrying about what people think. I mean, I'm sure my mom will hear this, but she knows it. She still worries about what people will think, and she's in her 70s. So it's amazing. And I'm fortunate that for whatever reason, my husband never thought that way. And he helps bring me back when I start thinking about that. And I've learned to change my thought process, but I definitely grew up the same way. Like, we're going to wear that? Your hair's going to look like that? What are you going to do? You know, like what you're going to, well, oh my God, you're going to do this? Like, what will people say? And thankfully, that's no longer an issue for my thought process day to day.
It's a tricky one, though, right? Because I think for me, it was that sense of if I was not caring so much about what people thought of me, I was not being empathic. And I hold empathy as one of my highest values, right? So I have to care. And they're my family, or they're my whatever, or they're the teacher. And so the minute that started going away from it, what was interesting, though, for me, Rena, was that strategy as I was trying to do what everyone wanted, and my life was not going well. I'm thinking, well, this strategy is not working and I'm not going to live forever. So I'm like, I'm just not going to do that anymore. And that really turned things around for me. Because really, in essence, you're living with your authenticity, right? It's conditions of worth that keep us from being healthy. Once I started taking those away, and it did mean I distanced from a lot of people and I changed my ground game and how I went through the world. It's much healthier for me, for sure. But I still do have that lingering need to prove to the world something. And it makes me tired. I work all the time and that's not good for me.
I think that's also a South Asian
It's
thing.
a very South Asian thing.
Because I think we all have that, unfortunately, for better or worse. What's a non-negotiable, something you have to do every day?
I have to make sure the feeders that feed my hummingbirds are full, and I have to make sure my cat gets fed. Seriously, those are my only two non-negotiables. And even if I'm away from Los Angeles, I will call the unfortunate person who's stuck in the house to say, is the cat been fed? Are the bird feeders full? Like literally, if I were to say that is non-negotiable, that's probably the only thing I do every day, and maybe take my vitamins at night, that I would say that are my absolutes.
Well, that seems very practical.
Yes, right. Yes.
What is something that you wish would change that could really dramatically change the world?
I wish that we would protect children from trauma. If we protected children from trauma, the entire world would change instantly. The devastation that has been wrought by the harm of children on the children themselves, on the adults they become, on the things that we don't ever get to learn because they never get launched, we've got to protect children. So if there was a way magically to ensure that only healthy people had kids, and the people who were going to be abusers didn't have kids, and all kids were protected from trauma. That's the thing. I know it would change the world.
Yeah, that's a big one. And like you mentioned earlier in the podcast, if we invested more in childhood, it would be huge.
And childhood safety, protection of childhood, letting children know they're important. We're so focused on parental rights that we don't think about children's rights. Children's rights are much more important.
Yeah, but even allowing parents to be home with their kids, like giving more leave in this country where everywhere else in the world, people get a year or 18 months of leave. We barely get 3 months.
Right. And that's a parental issue though. That's not even as interesting to me as protecting the kids. Yes, I think in many cases it'll be great for a kid. Yeah. Do you know who I want with that kid? Maybe the parent, maybe not. I want the safest, healthiest person. May or may not be the parent.
Absolutely. Yeah, agree. And then, what is a life hack or health hack that you would share?
Have something you can turn to at moments of overwhelm that you could do in quickly, easily, and accessibly. So in other words, it's a person's like, well, if I could meditate for an hour, I'm like, girl, you don't have an hour. You got 4 minutes. Okay. So that's why I don't like those big suggestions. So mine, as a result, are, believe it or not, a language app, like one of those language apps I do on my phone, and games I play on my phone. And as silly as that sounds, I'll be playing New York Times Connections, and I'll be so absorbed in that, or New York Times Tiles. They have the best games. It is so meditative, like how these connected or how these shapes, that I actually can bring myself out of a funk. It's just sort of for someone like me who had a history of trauma bonding and trauma, it sort of pops me out of that sort of that polyvagal thing and kind of gets me back into my kind of left brainy like awareness, like, okay, here we are. Because the funny thing about a game is, as banal as it is, it absorbs you for a minute. And that is actually my life hack. So I've got a phone full of games, and I mean, whether it's a crossword, whether it's Connections, whether it's Wordle, whether it's my Spanish language app, it has actually saved me more than you'd think. Because when I'm really feeling it, I will just, and books, when I can't do driving, so the time I can't do that, I always have a book that I can listen to, somehow getting into the story of a book. Those two things actually really help me reorient.
And those are easy and
they're very accessible, free, easy. And that's why I like them, because anything bigger than that, because I am incredibly bad at, especially at this point, since I'm trying to pitch a book, I'm not exercising right. I'm not sleeping as well as I'd want. I'm not eating well. All the things that I know are important. I do take a protein shake most mornings. That helps me. It's plant-based. It's healthy. It gives me a little bit of a kick. But even most mornings I run out of time for that. That's why I'm saying the only through line every day that I sometimes find myself turning to are these sorts of funny little games that kind of pop me out for a minute. And then I find myself sort of recalibrated and ready.
That's great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please, guys, check out Dr. Ramani's new book. I'm going to just show it here.
And there's another one right behind it.
Yeah, It's Not You. Okay, check out this book. It's amazing, and you will really find it helpful. I think everyone has experience with narcissists, right? And whether you have it as an intimate partner, a friend, as a parent, but I think it's really helpful to recognize the patterns and realize, oh, wow, this might actually be affecting my relationship. And if it's not making you feel good, then trying to get out of it is going to be probably the best thing if you can.
I mean, it may not always even make you feel good. I'd say if you don't feel safe, let's just bring it down to brass tacks. If you feel that you can't express a need, express a want, express a feeling without being shut down or shamed, you got a problem.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rena, for having me.
Where can people find you?
Yes, well, please order the books. You can order the book anywhere you can get books, but you can find me. I have a popular YouTube channel, and that's at Dr. Ramani. Just go to YouTube. Just go to YouTube, and you can find that. You can find me on all social media at Dr. Ramani. For people listening to this saying, I'd like to do a slightly deeper dive into healing, we have a monthly healing program that offers workshops and Q&A sessions and guided meditations and journal prompts and all kinds of materials to help people with their healing process. we have that. And if you're a therapist listening to this, I also have a 36-hour training program for therapists who want to get certified in working with clients experiencing narcissistic abuse. You can go to pessy.com to find that. Look for the one that's attached to my name, or you can go to my website to get that information. So lots of things to look into, and then always more coming. So just always go check out the website. I also have a podcast that's on hiatus, but the old episodes are all there, called Navigating Narcissism. You can check that out too.
Awesome. Well, thank you
so much, Rena.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's podcast. If you are enjoying the Rena Malik MD podcast, do me a huge favor. Go on Apple or Spotify, leave us a rating or review so that more and more people can see the benefit of listening to our podcast. And we love seeing when you share our clips from our podcast on Instagram, TikTok, and everywhere else, showing how much you really enjoyed the podcast. And if you're listening, be sure to check us out on YouTube and subscribe. It's, again, a zero-cost way to support the podcast. If you want to hear more from me, find me on all the social media platforms at Rena Malik MD. And as always, remember to take care of yourself because you are worth it.